Meine liebe Freund, Shalom Aleichem. My name is Mostel. I'm the Associate Artistic Director of the National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene. On behalf of our CEO, Christopher Massamine, and our Artistic Director, Zalman Lotek, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of this series of Fiddler Talks from Anatevke to Broadway and Back Again. Tonight, our topic is the making of Fiddler on the Roof. Hopefully all of you have either seen it or got your tickets or you're in the show. If you haven't gotten your tickets, don't wait. They are going like Hesa Latkes. I don't know if you heard, but the New York Times had some nice things to say about it. Tonight, we've got an unbelievable panel for you. I'm very glad that you were able to join us. Please give a very warm welcome to Alisa Solomon, professor of journalism at Columbia University and author of Wonder of Wonders, the Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof. It is the complete compendium and the most authoritative history of this production that you will ever read. It is for sale in the gift shop here at the museum, so if you don't already own a copy, I urge you to get a copy. Certainly after tonight's talk, you're going to want to read it. And of course, we've got the man himself. We have the lyricist Sheldon Harnick. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner and a Tony Award winner. He, of course, is a lyricist for Fiddler on the Roof, Fiorello, She Loves Me, and the Rothschilds, among many others. Please give a warm welcome to Alisa Solomon and Sheldon Harnick.
Your mic is on your lapel.
Oh, that's right.
I'm Alisa Solomon, and this is Sheldon Harnick. Just
in case you didn't know.
And it's really an honor and a pleasure to spend some time with Sheldon, whom I admire and adore. And it's a pleasure to sit on this stage where I had the pleasure this afternoon of seeing Fiddler Offendach, and I heard Mama just mention that there's some company members in the house, so Mazel Tov to all of you. And we've been invited to talk about the making of the show, the history of how Fiddler came to be. But just before we get into that, I thought we'd talk a little bit about this production, Sheldon, and we'll have about an hour for this conversation.
Before you say anything else, I should say this is one of the best productions of Fiddler that I've ever seen.
Wow. The show's been played in practically every language that there is. You know, French, Spanish, German, Swedish, Finnish, Turkish, Hindi, and I know you've seen it in many other languages, Hungarian.
I've yet to see it in English.
But I suspect this is the first time that you saw it, and maybe more importantly, heard it in Yiddish.
Yeah.
And apart from...
I didn't understand a word. Yiddish, my father spoke Yiddish, and my mother spoke a little, and they used the language, when they had secrets they wanted to keep from the children, they would speak in Yiddish. And since they didn't understand each other, the secrets were pretty good.
So I think among the creators, you and Jerry Bach and Joe Stein was the only one who actually grew up speaking some understanding Yiddish and knowing Yiddish. Apart from the well-deserved praise that you just gave to the production, what was new for you, or what struck you about hearing it in Yiddish?
Oh, the other night?
Well, yeah, just in...
I expected that it would sound different for some reason, and instead it sounded like a foreign language that I didn't know, and I was grateful for the subtitles on either side. I don't read Russian, so I had to do it in English. But I don't know if you've seen the show, but the snippets of lyrics that they were able to use amused me, because they were kind of broad translations from the Yiddish, and they're very far from mostly from what I wrote. So I looked at them with astonishment. I thought I wrote.
Were there any particular elements that you found especially moving or surprising in Yiddish?
No. As I say, it sounded. My wife and I have seen it. We saw a little bit of it. We weren't able to see the entire show in Hungary, but we saw a bit of it, and we saw it. I saw it in Germany. I've seen it and we saw it in Japan. So I'm used to hearing it in a foreign language, and that's the effect of it the other night. That, as I said, I thought because it was Yiddish, there'd be a lot of words that I remembered, and I would identify with them, but I didn't. It just sounded like a foreign language.
I mean, to me, one of the many things that struck me hearing the Yiddish were just some of the comic rhythms in both lyrics and in Joe Stein's book. That when Tega says, as we know well in English, it's no great honor either to be poor. I mean, when I heard that phrase in Yiddish, which I think was a größer Covid is a Soisni, suddenly I heard that the English rhythm came directly from that Yiddish.
Well, when Jerry Bach and I decided that we wanted to try and adapt the Sheldon Harnick story into a musical, and we asked ourselves who would do the book. And the very first person who came to mind was Joe. We had worked with Joe, and we knew that Joe grew up speaking Yiddish, which we thought would be a plus. And he had read all of the Sheldon Harnick stories when he was growing up, so he was the perfect person to ask.
Well, that's a perfect segue. Thank you. Let's talk about how you came to do the Tega stories. Why were you and Jerry Bach interested in Sheldon Harnick?
The way we worked, one of us would find a story that we loved, and we'd introduce the other person to it, and if we really loved it that much, then we'd go forward with it and try and adapt it into a musical. And that happened. I don't remember why I was reading the Sheldon Harnick stories, but I decided that it was time that I read them. And as I read them, and especially the Tega stories, I began to think, oh, this could be a musical.
What about Wandering Stars?
What?
I think you told me it started with Wandering Stars, the novel Wandering Stars.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah, the huge Sheldon Harnick novel. When we decided to do it as a musical, I was thinking about that in the last few days. It's amazing that we went ahead with it, because whenever we wanted to do something, if we found that somebody else had the rights, we just gave up. And it turned out that not only did someone have the rights to the story, but there was actually a play based on Tevia's Daughters that was being done at the Carnegie Hall Playhouse. And it was in 3 acts. We went to see it. Each act was about one daughter. They never put the whole family together. But, and it was, I don't remember the play at all. So that says something about it.
It was by Arnold Pearl, and it was
by Arnold Pearl. And whenever you see the title of the show in an ad, underneath the ad, you will see, by special arrangement with Arnold Pearl. We had to do that. I wanted it to read, by special arrangement with Arnold Pearl, may his bones be broken. But I was outvoted.
Yeah, well, because he drove a very hard bargain to, he had the rights to the material.
Yeah.
And he was a communist, so he was really good at driving a hard bargain. I mean, that's a whole interesting story in itself, but not the story we're here.
I'm just amazed that we went ahead with it when there was this other version.
So you must, something you'd read Wandering Stars and you loved it, but you thought it was too sprawling to be a musical in terms
I
of
thought it
the
was,
stories.
I don't know if you've read the book, it's a huge book, and it's, I think somebody actually did dramatize it.
Well, yeah, Maurice Schwartz did.
When I did
In the Yiddish Art Theater, huh?
When I read it, I thought it's too big. I wouldn't know how to deal with that much material. But it's a wonderful novel, which I recommend to you. Go out and buy a copy.
Yeah,
So,
and,
or borrow a copy, which is what I would do.
Support your public library. So you turned to the Tender stories. You stuck with it even with this rights problem because obviously there was something extremely compelling about those stories.
We were so moved by the stories. We read them and they're funny and they're touching. The one that we really debated about using is the one that's really tragic. The daughter who falls in love with a wealthy young Jewish boy who's visiting that area, and then his mother disapproves of the relationship, so she takes the boy and they leave. And they just abandon the girl, and she drowns herself.
Oh, no.
And we were debating whether to use that. We thought, no, the tone of the show that we're aiming for does not allow for that kind of tragedy.
Mm-hmm. No, I remember seeing, when I was researching your work, your early work on it, I remember seeing the Sprinter story and some outlines and some notes about it. So you debated it for a little while. Well, that's pretty much it. I mean, there were just some scenarios and some descriptions and so on, and then it's just abandoned.
Yeah.
For the reasons that you say. And the Tender stories, when you decided to do them, it was hard to find copies. They had been translated into English by Joseph and Frances Butwin, and
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
I had to go to several bookstores before I found an old tattered copy of Tender Stories.
Yeah, and so it was the one primary translation in English, and now today we have quite a few different translations, and I think in part that's thanks to the success of Fiddler on the Roof.
Definitely, yeah. After Fiddler, there were several books published of short stories by Sheldon Harnick.
Which I think is a really good, just in case we need a retort to the Yiddishists who haven't always had nice things to say about Fiddler on the Roof for not being, the real Shalom Aleichem, is that the show enabled a lot more people to go back to the Shalom Aleichem stories by renewing interest in them and creating the possibility for more translations to be available.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned some of the ways that you and Jerry Bach worked. You would find a story or something that one of you liked and talk about it with each other and decide to go forward. And can you describe a little bit the method you had for how you wrote songs?
Yeah, the way I worked with Jerry Bach, I've never worked this way with anybody else. Once we both knew what the source material was, we would go into our respective studios and I'd begin to try and figure out where the songs might occur and what they might be about. And Jerry would do the same thing in his studio, but he would start to write music for a scene. And then when he had written about 8 to a dozen musical numbers, he'd record them on a tape and he'd send me the tape and I would listen to it. And it was fun because he'd say, Shel, I think this one is for the butcher. In the scene. I think this one might be for Zeitl. And he was always wrong, but
Okay, well, we actually have an example. I brought some audio of exactly one of these examples. Abby, would you play the first clip, please?
Shel, I just hit something that I'm very happy about. It has an authentic folk Russian feel, a la Moissaiev. It gives me the spirit of the girls in Tevye on a flirting idea, coquette. And it has the bubble, the slight tease, but it's unashamedly sentimental. So.
not a bad lyric.
So he heard something flirty for the girls, coquettish. You heard something entirely different. We all recognize what that became, right?
I did. And I think I was just walking down the street, humming the tune to myself, looking for a lyric, and from somewhere came the words sunrise, sunset, and I thought, oh, what a lovely idea. And then I wrote the lyric rather quickly. And the first one that I played it for, I called my sister, and I read her the lyric. And then I heard that she was crying on the other end of the telephone. I thought, oh my God, it can't be that bad. No, she loved it. And we played it for Jerry's wife, and she wept too. So I thought, this must be a rather special song. And it proved to be.
Although I think we'll talk a little later about the director choreographer Jerry Robbins, but since we're talking about this song, I think I remember you telling me once that he was frustrated about that song. He wanted to know what Tevye and Golda were doing with it.
That's right, he didn't know how to stage it. And then finally, he had the brilliant idea of using it during the wedding, where it was, it seemed appropriate and suitable. So he found a place for it. Jerry always found a place for what he wanted to use.
Yeah, so he joined the project after you
Well,
and
we
Robbins
originally, by the time that we wanted to do Fiddler, Jerry Bach and I had done 3 shows, 2 shows that were produced by Harold Prince, and 1 show, She Loves Me, that was both produced and directed by Hal Prince. So we went to Hal with the show, and we asked him to direct it, and Hal turned us down. He said, if this were possibly about Western Jews, I might consider it, but this is Eastern, and I would not be the right person to do this. I'll tell you who you should go to. Go to Jerome Robbins. So we went to Robbins, and he was very touched by the material, and when he agreed to do it, we didn't know what we were in.
Mm-hmm. So he was very engaged in the working on the text and the songs and so on, even before rehearsals started, and he marked up a lot of things.
I don't remember him ever turning down a song. I think there were several songs that we wrote that eventually Jerry and I realized were not right for the show. We wrote a song for the butcher that was all about meat. And it was appropriate.
So I have here a copy of a letter that Jerry Robbins wrote to you and Jerry Bach in April of 1964. So it was before that you cast the show. You were still working on it. It was cast shortly after that, and then rehearsed in the summer of '64, and then went to Detroit and Washington before it came here to open in September of '64. In April of '64, he wrote you this long letter declaring, and I quote, "What has to be done by the end of this month." And he says, "I find it incredible and unforgivable that you are in London writing songs for She Loves Me instead of working on our Tevye project." And he thought the score was too one-dimensional, repetitive, and he wanted more variation, and so on. It goes on. And then you and Jerry Bach wrote back, "Dear Reb Robbins, received your very explicit summary," etc., etc. And then in the end, you say, "Please, Reb Robbins, don't holler or we'll come home by horse." And I mean, there's a lot of details in here, but I think that the general reason I bring it up is to just kind of talk about the working method that you had with him, what he was like as a collaborator.
I wish I could talk about that, but it's been my experience, and it's been a sad experience, that I think I could say every musical that I've done, I haven't finished my work by the time the show went into rehearsal. So the show would be in rehearsal, and I'd still be back in my apartment struggling with the songs that were missing. So I missed rehearsals. With Fiddler, almost the only time I saw Robbins work, I knew that he was going to stage the opening number, Tradition. So I wanted to see that. I went, and for about 2 hours, he worked on Tradition, and it was like watching a great sculptor, but instead of working with wood or marble, he was working with people. And just to watch him put the thing together, and we had an incidental, a composer of incidental music, and every once in a while he'd turn to her and say, give me 4 bars here, give me 2 bars here. And he put the thing together. It was just astonishing to watch him work. I wish that I'd had the opportunity to see him do more, but I didn't.
So you mentioned the opening number, and we'll talk a little bit about how that came about. But before you had the opening number that we all know and love, rendered as Tradicia here, you had a different opening number, and we're going to hear it now. Abby, would you play the second clip, please?
Mama, mama, we finished what you told us. Mama, mama, can we go out and play? No. I rubbed the table clean, and I scrubbed all the chairs up and down and in between. Mama, mama, can we go? Mama, can we go? Mama, can we go and play? There's still too much to do today. Did you change the towel? Then put on the center tablecloth. Set the table and don't go away. Mama, you must be so nervous. Mama, mama, for heaven's sake, relax. So who can relax while there's so much to be done? Keeping one eye on the soup and the other on the sun. Mama, mama, don't be nervous. Mama, don't be ready long before the sun has set. We never miss the Sabbath yet. Somehow the house will be clean. Floors will be wet. Soup will be cooked. Beef will be boiled. Now there's noodles to make and chicken to be plucked and liver to be chopped and olives to be baked to raise with the sun. So at the proper time the candles will be lit and blessed. There's noodles to make and chicken to be plucked and liver to be chopped and olives to be baked to raise with the sun. So at the proper time the candles will be lit and blessed. The wood will be warm. The liver will be chopped and olives to be baked. So at the proper time the candles will be blessed. But on Friday I eat, not a rabbi, but a cook. Also put away the mama, let me lock my with a million things I really need. God gives me daughters who can read. Mama, finish with the collar. Thank you, sweetheart, now put it in the stove. The soup and the noodles and the collars in control, and the fish, where's the fish? Mama, look inside your bowl. Better rest a little, mama, rest a little. If we don't get finished, woe is me. What kind of welcome would that be for Sabbath, 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 clean and bright, all work and all worry must be set aside. Mama, mama, the boys want to dance. Mama, mama, tell me what to do. Mama, mama, the girls want to dance. Mama, mama, can we go out and play? No, we work and we worry. We become content. Will we do our work in time to enjoy our day of rest? Every week the same promotion, every week the full, every week we all forget. We never miss the Sabbath.
Oh, I listened to that and I miss Jerry Bach terribly. Jerome Robbins loved that number, but he said, we really need something that says something in total about what the show is about. So that set us off in a different direction. And Jerry came up with the music for tradition first. I think.
Well, tell us about how he came up with the concept. Then he kept asking you what the show was about.
Oh, Robbins.
Yeah.
Yeah. We about 6 months before the show was to go into rehearsal, I think 6 months, 8 months, we began to have frequent meetings with Jerry Robbins. And almost every meeting started with the same question. Guys, what is this show about? Because he had to know. And because of the questions he asked, we solved a lot of problems that we didn't have to solve later when we were on the road. Because he kept finding places that were puzzles to him, and we had to solve those before he could go into rehearsal. So along the way, we came up with the concept of a song about tradition that would set up what much of the show is about. And as I say, Jerry wrote the music first, and I set the lyric to it. Listening to this reminds me, one of the great pleasures of working with Jerry was when we were ready, he would turn on the recording machine and we would sing together, and he would play the piano, and we would record one of the numbers and then listen to it back. I remember we did, I don't remember which number it was, but about halfway through the number, we were doing it, his wife came downstairs, his studio was in the basement, and she listened to it, and she was just beaming from ear to ear at the end of it, and we thought, oh, that what number works. So it was great fun to work with Jerry. I would say that about 50 to 60% of the music came first. As I say, we went into our respective studios and we worked. And when he had written 8 to 12 numbers, he would send me a tape, which was something I could begin to work on. And that was always, listening to that tape, in a way, it was like a world premiere. No one had ever heard these songs before, and I was hearing them. Which brings back a memory. We were looking for performers, and we heard about a performance, a benefit for the Hebrew Actors Guild. So we went down to we watched the performance, and during the performance, a mother and daughter came out, and they did a song with no words. It was just syllables. And Jerry was so taken with that he went home. He called me early the next morning. He said, Shel, I have worked all night. I've got something you must hear. And then he sent me this tape, and there were no lyrics to it, but he was going ba 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 ba, using those things. And it was ba 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 ba. And I heard it, and I think I had just read the story, If I Were a Rothschild, and I thought, ooh, that fits that music absolutely, except instead of Rothschild, I'll make it a little more general by saying rich man. So that was the way that got written.
Well, that's a good way to introduce the fifth genius, the creative genius, who was part of the making of Fiddler, and that, of course, is Mostel, who brought a lot to that song, and especially to those syllables.
He did. I was kind of surprised when Jerry Robbins wanted zero, because he was not my concept of Tevye. My concept of Tevye was very much like Stephen Skybro. He was kind of an ideal Tevye. My knowledge of Zero was just as a comic who did brilliant comedy, but I couldn't picture him in the sad parts. As it turned out, Zero was a wonderful choice. Jerry Robbins simply said, "I want someone who's larger than life in his show," and Zero is larger than life, and he was. Yeah.
And he also came from actually a very observant Yiddish-speaking home. He knew the material very well. And I thought of him, well, he and Jerry Robbins were not the best of friends.
Oh, well, that was embarrassing because the first day of rehearsal, we knew that Robbins and Zero were enemies. And so we were waiting. Zero got there before Jerry.
Because of the blacklist. Because Jerry Robbins had named names.
Yeah, he had named names before the American Activities Committee. So Zero was there, the cast was there, we were all waiting for Robbins. And finally Robbins came in, and Zero looked at him and said, "Hi there, blabbermouth." And luckily, that struck Jerry Robbins as very funny, and he laughed, and then the cast laughed, and we were okay.
So I was thinking of one of my favorite stories about the many ways that Zero Mostel would kind of needle Jerry Robbins when I was watching the show here this afternoon. You know, when the way walls and doorways are suggested in this nice unit set is, and the first stage is by everybody kissing the mezuzah on the way in and out of wherever, you know, whichever home they're going into in the show. And there was an argument between Jerry Robbins and Zero Mostel about that. Do you remember it?
I don't.
Then I'll tell us.
I put it out of my mind.
So Zero, having, you know, grown up observant and knowing the kind of world Tevye lived in, would kiss the mezuzah every time he came into Tevye's house. And in rehearsal one day, Jerry Robbins told him not to do it anymore. He said, "Stop doing that. The audience won't understand it." And Zero said, "Yeah, but Tevye would do this, and I'm going to keep doing it." And they just, you know, he'd say, "Take the entrance again," and Zero would come back and he'd kiss the mezuzah, and Jerry would get angrier and angrier. And you know, and he said, "Zero, just do not do that again. We're not going forward if you know, do that one more time." And so Zero came through, you know, came through the door and went like this. So it was a kissing stadium.
I've never heard that story.
So we talked. We heard haven't missed the Sabbath yet. You mentioned the Butcher's song. Mostel had a song to the sewing machine, My Dear Sweet Sewing Machine, that was cut. There were a number of other songs that great songs that you and Jerry Bach wrote that were cut. And then you wrote a song for the film that didn't get put into the film after all, but we got to hear a bit of it in this production, Any Day Now.
Any Day Now.
Tell us about that song.
When we were asked to do the film, I was hoping that we would be asked to add some songs, and Norman Jewison, who directed it, said he wanted a song for the young revolutionary Perchik. So Jerry wrote the music first, and I listened to the music and I thought, that's a wonderful, the music just suits Perchik perfectly. Any day, and the lyric came very quickly, and Jewison liked it. Is that not in the film? I thought it was. I'll have to go see the movie.
You
which is
find
no
it on
hardship.
YouTube. Yeah, but it was really a nice surprise to have it sort of interpolated here into the scene when Perchik is giving the lessons, and I think our wonderful Perchik here.
I don't know whose idea that was, but it was very clever, whoever came up with that. Yeah, it's very suitable.
And I think Daniel Kahn, who's the lovely Perchik here, translated it into Yiddish. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Bravo. Why is your show called Fiddler on the Roof? Because I know there were, in the notes, for the longest time it's just called Tevya when you're writing to each other.
Well, we wanted to call it Anything Goes, but that had been taken. we had a list of about 15 titles, and one of the titles, I don't know where it came from, who came up with it, was Fiddler on the Roof. Oh, well, I know where the title came from. I think someone had showed us the Chagall painting of a fiddler standing on the roof. And as a matter of fact, he's standing about 6 inches above the roof, which is interesting. And we were very taken with that. That was where that title came from. But we had, I think we had 12, 15 titles. And when Hal Prince became not only our producer, when he became our producer, he said, we need a title. And so we showed him our list. And he looked down the list and he stopped and he said, Fiddler on the Roof, that suggests music. And this is a musical, and that's important, so let's use that. And that's why it was, why the title is Fiddler on the Roof.
And then Joe Stein had to go back and write some material at the beginning of the show to sort of explain.
Right, yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I wrote the opening monologue. Yeah.
Aha.
Yeah. Not many people know that. I haven't heard that. I never told my wife. I thought it would seem like bragging.
So the show played, as I said, it had tryouts in Detroit and in Washington, and there was still quite a lot of work being done, especially in Detroit, and some, like the Bottle Dance didn't even go until after it opened in Washington. It changed a fair amount even there. And then came to New York to open in September of 1964. Can you take us back to that, to September 22nd, 1964, the opening night, and what the atmosphere was like, what your expectations were, what the response was?
I can't imagine what the audience, what their expectations were. All I knew was that the show had been very successful, both in Detroit and Washington, and so I was hoping that it would be equally successful in New York. And our previews, the audiences were wonderful. They were very enthusiastic, a lot of, and very loud in their response. Opening night, for some reason, the audience was very quiet, which was quite worrisome. We thought, oh my God, they're not liking it. But at the end, there was just this shout of approval, and people leaped to their feet. So I was, needless to say, I was relieved. And then the next day, there was a huge line at the box office. The reviews were not all that great. I think the New York Times, if I remember correctly, he said, oh, this could have been quite a show if instead of Jerry Bach, and he mentioned some classical Jewish composer, Ernest Bloch, I think, he said, if Ernest Bloch had written the score. And I called Jerry and I commiserated with him. I think we had one rave review in the Daily News, and the rest of them were quite mixed. I think Walter Kerr said something to the effect of, this could have been a really wonderful show if they hadn't kept going back to Broadway shtick. So we had to put up with a lot of that. But the audiences did not react that way at all. They loved it from the beginning. Yeah, and there were huge lines, as I say. And as a matter of fact, I think we opened in the fall, and the weather was kind of chilly, so Hal Prince had the brilliant idea of serving coffee to the people who were standing in line. And I think that made them all buy even more tickets.
I mean, the show was hugely popular, obviously. He said it ran for a record-breaking almost 8 years at the time. What do you think it meant to people, and how do you think that meaning has changed over the years?
Oh, I can't answer that question. I do remember being in the audience and looking around and seeing, I remember one performance, I looked around and I saw a number of people who looked like they had been Holocaust survivors. And they were standing there just transfixed by the show. I don't remember them smiling or applauding or everything, but just riveted. And I thought, my God, this show means more to people than we think it does. You know, we were trying simply to realize the beauty of the Sheldon life and stories, not trying to do something that was going to affect people around the world. But my wife and I have seen it, as I say, in various countries, including Japan. And the Tevye in Japan said, do they really understand this show? In New York, it's so Japanese. When I tell that to people, nobody quite believes that anybody said that. But the Tevye did say that.
Let's take some questions.
Oh.
And I'm going to, because of the webcast, I'm going to repeat the questions into the microphone. So, yes.
So, my parents saw a production, I don't know, a year or two ago at a high school somewhere in western Massachusetts where there are no Jews. And they said it was just wonderful and the kids just did a great job. I feel like there are a lot of people in this country, maybe all over the world, where this show is really their only connection to Yiddishkeit, to that culture, or our culture. And how do you feel about that? Do you think?
I'm going to repeat the question. Thanks. The question is that the show is the only aspect of Ashkenazi Jewish culture that a lot of people in the United States and around the world are ever exposed to. How do you feel about that show?
When I read currently about the rise of anti-Semitism in certain European countries, I feel very strongly that Fiddler has helped to fight anti-Semitism. It's introduced the Jewish culture to a lot of people who wouldn't know anything about it, and I think that it's done good. I don't know that anything can counteract the causes of anti-Semitism, but at least Fiddler has tried.
Yes, I'll just sort of go from the front toward the back. So.
You mentioned that you would start writing the lyrics when you received a number of the musical pieces. So my question is, what did you do before you started writing? While he was doing the music?
The question was before Jerry Box sent you tapes, which I guess were little reel-to-reel tapes in those days. He might have worked faster if he had MP3s back then. But while he was working on the music, before you had the music, what were you doing?
I was studying those stories, and the more I studied them, the more I found ideas for songs in them. And I would just mark up my copy of the Sheldon Life and Stories and wait until Jerry had sent me music, because this was our 5th show together. Our first show was a big flop called The Body Beautiful. But then we had three shows. Fiorella was a big hit.
Fiorella, which has more Yiddish in it than Fiddler has.
Yeah. Tenderloin was around about 6 months. The backers got most of their money back. She Loves Me, oddly enough, lost almost every penny of its investment, but it turned out to be a show that had a life, had a future, and it's had many, many performances since then. So it was The Body Beautiful, Fiorella, Tenderloin, She Loved Me, and then Fiddler. And I read the stories, and as I say, I waited because, from the beginning of the relationship with Jerry, I discovered that he would send me music. I'd never had that before with a collaborator, where they gave me music first. And usually, on any tape, as I said, there'd be maybe 8 to 12 songs, of which only maybe 2 or 3 were exciting to me. But nevertheless, having 2 or 3 songs that I couldn't wait to put lyrics to, that was exciting. And I would walk around. I was walking in the street one day, humming a song, and suddenly I heard this horn, and I looked up, and I was directly in front of a huge Mack truck. It almost ran me over. And the driver just leaned out the window and yelled at me, cursed at me. And I said, "It's okay, I got the lyric."
You said that you were studying the stories. There was also some background material that you were reading, like Life is with People, the ethnography, very odd history of that book, but a very important one in the 50s, and there are very specific images and even phrases that make their way into the show.
I don't remember all of the reading, but I didn't limit my reading to Sheldon Harnick. There were other books that had to do with Judaism, and I read them. Everything was Christopher McMillan.
Wow, lots of questions. So I'm gonna sort of give everybody a number, like in Zabar's. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll do these. Let's collect all the questions and then answer them, and then we'll do another set. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Is there a film or tape of any of the Zero Mostel productions, and is there any chance of that being released if there is?
Okay. The question was, are there any tapes of Zero Mostels in production, and is there any chance of them being released? I think the answer is no.
There is, I think one of the Tony broadcasts, Zero did a number, and that's filmed. But that's about the only thing.
A revival in 71, was it, is taped at the New York Public Library. It's on the shows on tape in the archive at the library, but you need special permission from the Robbins estate, Robbins Trust, to see it, and for good reason. It's not a very good performance, unfortunately. Who was number 2?
Hi. So, Karen, you talk about drawing your inspiration from the Solomon story of Sheldon calls to mind another brilliant lyricist and creator, and I know that you're also very generous with young creative people. Have you and Lin-Manuel Miranda met and perhaps even worked on something together?
Let me repeat the question, please.
Miranda and I are very good friends.
Yeah. The question was, has Sheldon met Lin-Manuel Miranda? I'm just repeating it for the webcast.
Yeah, I met Lin. He was on the Dramas Guild Council, and he invited us to see Hamilton when it was in previews. So my wife and I went down to see it. We were just blown away by it, and we went back to see it again. It's a remarkable show, and he's a remarkably talented young man.
So two more.
What?
Have you thought about working on anything together?
No.
Well, I can tell you too.
Lin does all. I think he writes book lyrics and music. He doesn't need me. He doesn't know it, but he does.
He did say, however, that In the Heights was very much influenced by Fiddler. That the idea of a community, the coherence of the community, and the breaking apart of the community was something that inspired In the Heights. And if you've never seen it, go on YouTube and search Lin-Manuel Miranda wedding L'Chaim, and you'll be in for a treat. Who's number 3?
I think also available is a film of his father-in-law, and I forgot whether he's dancing too, but they do one of the songs from Fiddler. And the camera keeps going to his wife, and she's sitting there with her mouth open.
Yes, number 3.
I'm curious, when any of your shows are translated into another language, do you ever have the authority to disapprove of lyrics that you may feel are not translating the way you would like them to?
If I wanted to ask for it, I'm pretty sure I would be given that, but I haven't asked. for some reason. I've always assumed that they would get somebody good to do it. That may have been a mistake on my part, but I haven't asked. And usually, as far as I know from the reviews of those shows, they've gotten good people.
Who's number 4? Yes.
Can you possibly identify your career or educational pathway that allowed you to become such a genius?
The question was, how did you get to be such a genius?
No, it just happened.
I mean, do you want to, maybe this is a good place to talk about the kind of workshop experience, is maybe the best thing to call it, that you had writing for reviews, and those kinds of projects where you were writing songs very quickly.
I have an older sister. She's no longer with us, but she wrote poetry, and some of it was quite beautiful, and some of it was quite witty, and I wanted to try and do that too. So I began to write verse quite young while I was still in grammar school. I wrote it in high school, and in high school I met a collaborator. We began, and he wanted to write songs. He wanted to write for the theater, which was something I'd never considered. So with him, we began to write sketches, and as a matter of fact, we performed at one of the downtown Chicago theaters. I've forgotten which one, but they had an amateur show, and we went on, and we each got $25, and nobody booed, so it was passable. But that was, when I was in the Army, I wrote a song for a friend of mine. I wrote it for his wife. And a couple of other guys asked me, would I write songs for their girlfriends? So I started to write those. And then I was stationed in Robbinsfield, Georgia, and it turned out they had Monday night shows. And I began to participate in those shows. And one of the men who was responsible for the shows was a man named Sal Lerner. And Sal was a New York agent. He was in the Army, and his wife was a choreographer named June Taylor. She had done the Jackie Gleason show. So when I finally left Chicago and came to New York, I hooked up with Sal, and he was very important in getting me started. He wanted to put me with the June Taylor dancers, but I said no.
Okay, so now I need to stack up another line of hands. So let me go all the way to the back. So you'll be 1 back there, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. Okay. Yes.
Oh, okay. So it was wonderful to hear. I've never listened to Sabbath yet, and what jumped out at me was what I call daughter's theme. So that's the part that actually makes it from that song into tradition. But it's also what people now associate as the fiddler theme. So what's the meaning of the fiddler theme and the daughter theme? Who does mama teach being the same Sabbath?
Okay, let me just repeat the question. So the melody that the daughters sing in tradition, and who does mama teach, etc., is pretty much the same as it's the fiddler theme in general. What meaning does it have that the daughter's theme is the same as the theme for the show overall?
I wish I'd been clever enough to think, oh boy, I can take this, and there's a reason why I'm using it. But there wasn't. I just like the tune.
Who is 2? Yes.
Is there 1 or 2 songs that are favorites of yours from the show?
Do you have a favorite song or a couple of favorite songs from the show?
I don't. I love the score altogether. And there are times when I look at the score and think, how did I manage to do that? It just, I guess because of my own background in Judaism, that I'm about to say something that I don't think I quite believe, but it's nice. That I felt it was a privilege to be able to use my talent to write this show.
Who was number 3 in this round? Yes.
I heard many years ago through the theater grapevine that during out-of-town tryouts that Bert Convy had pitched you and Jerry Bach on writing a song for his character Perchik. Is that true?
Yeah.
Let me repeat the question.
On the airplane.
Yeah.
On the airplane.
Yeah,
Bert.
Bert Convy was the original Perchik, and he wanted a song, and he asked you for one. Is that what happened?
All the actors asked me that. Especially B. Arthur, who was playing Yenta. Yeah. And B was such a wonderful performer, it bothered me that I couldn't think of a song for her. In one of the production, years later, we did find a song for her. It's called Topsy Turvy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But at the time, I couldn't think of one.
Didn't you originally have Miracle of Miracles for Perchik, and then decide that it fit better
I think that's true. I think that's
for a model, and then you wrote a new song.
Yeah.
It's like they took the song away from Perchik, and then wrote.
We had.
Now I have everything.
I think we had given Mostel a ballad, actually.
Your Sweet Sewing Machine.
No, it was something else.
Oh.
And then we heard Austin sing it, Austin Pendleton, and thought, nope. He sang well enough, but he was not equipped to handle a ballad like that.
And he's going to be here in a couple of weeks for one of these talks, so you can get his point of view on that. Is there a follow-up to that?
I'm just curious, wasn't Irwin Pearl also in the production, the original production?
I'm sorry?
No. Irwin Pearl?
Irwin Pearl.
Arnold Pearl?
Irwin Pearl in the original production? I don't think
There
so.
might have been. There have been so many productions and so many people. It's a large cast that I don't remember all the people in it. That name does not sound familiar. Irwin Pearl.
Who was next in the were you number 4?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just wondering what and if there was a discussion about mounting a musical, a play that is so Jewish, ethnically oriented for Broadway and not, say, Second Avenue.
Okay. Was there any reluctance on anyone's part or any anxiety about doing a show about Jews in the Bound Settlement for Broadway in the early 1960s?
Oh, definitely. Yes, we were worried about that. But I told myself, look, I was drafted, I was a soldier in World War II fighting Hitler, and I thought, if that doesn't prepare an audience for a show about Jews, then what does? You know, but we were worried. I don't remember running into any overt anti-Semitism about the show.
There were producers. I remember you telling me that when you were sort of doing auditions for producers, backers auditions, and so on, there were people who said, or for investors, I guess mostly, people who said, well, this is all very nice, but what are you going to do for ticket sales when you run out of Hadassah groups?
Yeah, no, that's true. At our backers auditions, people were enthusiastic, but then I would hear them on the way out, and they were worried about it. That is this a show that's going to have such a limited audience that there's no sense in producing it? They were wrong.
Yes.
What lyric that you wrote are you most proud of? And also, could you please talk a little bit, if it's true, about all the ad-libbing that Zero Mostel did?
Zero never ad-libbed. What he would do, if you can express it this way, he would ad-lib physically. And he would do terribly funny things, and sometimes he would do things that were outrageous. In fact, he emptied his milk can into the orchestra pit once, and the bassoon player almost killed him because the milk went into his bassoon. So you never knew what Zero would do physically, but he did not ad-lib. He never added words.
And what was your favorite
Do you have a lyric that you're most proud of?
Oh, not in that show, no. I have an unproduced show, which I hope will be produced one day. It's called Dragons. And some of the lyrics in there are my favorite Probably because they're my crippled children, they haven't been produced yet. So.
I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions. I see a hand back there. Oh, okay, and we'll take 3. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. Yes.
What do you look for in a lyric?
What do you look for in a lyric?
What do I look for?
Mm-hmm. Or what you try for?
What I always look for, and it's the only way it's the best way I can write, is to think of what the character, the dramatic situation, what the character is thinking and feeling, and trying to emphasize with that. Think, what would I, as a character, if I had this problem, what would I say? How would I feel about it? So I try and make it as personal as possible, and that allows me to write the lyric. It's very hard to write a lyric when I'm not connected with it that way. Then it's purely a matter of craft and verbal imagination. And I've done some good work that way, but I'm not as proud of that work as I am with the work that's really close to me.
Hi. What are the biggest differences you see between Broadway and the American theater now versus then? And what is one thing you would tell future theater makers to take heed of in the coming years?
What's the difference between Broadway when you were starting, or at the time Fiddler opened, and today, and what advice would you give to young, aspiring Broadway creative artists of today?
I think the biggest difference that I see is in what set designers are able to do physically. They're able to do gorgeous things, which they weren't able to do before because of advances in technology. Otherwise, I don't see that much difference in the literary techniques. What was the second half of the question?
Advice for young theater artists.
Oh, the advice that I always give to a young writer is, when you write, try and find any kind of an audience for what you write, wherever that audience may be, because you don't learn until you see how the work affects people. If it's a comedy song, they better laugh or they're in trouble. But you always want to see how a thing lands, how it affects people, whether they understand it, whether you've been clear in what you're trying to say, so that it's very important to find audiences.
Thank you. When we first went to rehearsal, we weren't saying the word tradition, we were saying the Torah, the Toya, and we were told to change it because you objected to it. Was it too off the mark? Was it too Jewish? Was it too...
Well, let me repeat the question.
Yeah, I always thought of Torah as the actual Torah, the parchment manuscript, you know, so that thinking of it that way, it didn't seem to say what I wanted it to say. And then when I was told that there is a word, traditsai, that we could use that was in effect saying tradition, I was delighted.
So what was the question?
The question was, in Schrager Friedman's translation of Fiddler into Yiddish that he made in the mid-60s, for the first performances in Yiddish that lasted about 2 weeks in Israel, after it played there in Hebrew, he translated the opening number as Ditoira instead of tradition, sort of fusing the idea of the tradition and the law and the learning that are like subsumed into the idea of Torah, so that the opening number was Ditoira, and what we heard, I think, now from our marvelous Yenta, was that as they started rehearsals here, they started that way, but then Sheldon requested that they use traditia instead, and that's the answer that you just heard.
Yeah, Torah I thought was a Japanese word.
So we have to wrap up. I'd like to close by asking you, Sheldon, what you're working on now, and I think you have a promising future ahead. What can we expect next from you?
Well, as I mentioned, the show called Dragons. It's based on a play by a Soviet playwright named Eugene Schwartz. It's a wonderful play, and I saw it about 40 years ago. A group called the Phoenix Theater did it in New York, and I was just blown away by the first act. The second act puzzled me, but I managed to buy a copy of it. I read it and discovered that reading it, the first act was wonderful. In the second act, apparently the play had been written as an anti-Stalinist play. And the only way the playwright could get it on was by making the second act very, it was hard to understand. You know, the Russians knew what was being said, but the rest of us didn't. So I found that I could get the rights to it and just threw out the second act. And it took years, since I considered myself not a playwright, but a lyricist. It took years because I was working now as a playwright trying to redo the second act. And it took about 30, 40 years before I got something that I really liked. And I really like it now. I'm going to try to get it produced.
Thank you very much, Alisa Solomon and Sheldon Harnick. We'd like to thank our partners here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, President and CEO Michael Glickman. Thank you to Miriam Heyer and to Laura Salvatore for making this possible. Thank you for coming today. Thank you, our web viewers, for joining us. Please join us again for this series. Next Wednesday, July 25th, we present Joel Gray, our choreographer Stash Kniech, and our musical director and artistic director Zalman Lotek in conversation here. Bud Mishkin will modify that panel. On August 8th, we present Harvard professor Ruth Weiss talking about the literary Tevye. August 22nd, we present Bob Spiano in Shalom Sholem, a one-man show about Shalom Aleichem. And then on August 29th, we present Austin Pendleton, the original Broadway Mostel, together with Rosalind Harris, who played Seitel in the film version of Fiddler on the Roof, as well as on Broadway, and then reprised as Golda in the 1990 revival. We hope that you'll join us for all of these events. To get tickets for the Fiddler Talks, please visit mjhnyc.org. For tickets to Fiddler auf dem Dach, please visit nytf.org. Thank you very much.